I never thought I'd be telling this story. Sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I can still see the Beverly Hills mansion where my life changed forever. My name is Sarah Williams, and I just turned 18 last month. Until recently, my biggest concerns were maintaining my Instagram following and deciding which college to attend next fall. Life had a way of feeling permanent back then, like the California sunshine that streamed through my bedroom window every morning. Our house was a testament to success, a sprawling Mediterranean-style mansion with a view that stretched all the way to the Pacific. My father, Michael Williams, built his real estate empire from nothing. He was the kind of man who commanded respect just by walking into a room, tall, well-dressed, with salt and pepper hair that made him look distinguished rather than old. My mother, Grace, balanced his intensity with her gentle nature. She taught English at the local high school, not because we needed the money, but because she loved helping students discover their voice through literature. I remember the day everything changed with perfect clarity. It was one of those rare overcast days in Los Angeles, the kind that makes everyone drive a little slower and speak a little softer. Mom and I were in the kitchen, the warm glow of pendant lights creating shadows that danced across the marble countertops. The aroma of her famous tomato basil soup filled the air, and I was half-heartedly helping her chop vegetables while scrolling through TikTok. "Sarah, honey, could you put the phone down for a minute?" Mom asked, her voice carrying that familiar mix of patience and exasperation. I sighed, locked my screen, and picked up the knife again. "Dad's late," I observed, glancing at the designer clock on the wall. Mom nodded, a small crease forming between her eyebrows. "He said he had some important meetings today." The phone rang, its sharp trill cutting through the kitchen's warmth like a knife. Mom wiped her hands on her apron and reached for it. "It's probably your father," she said, but something in her voice sounded uncertain. I watched as she answered, noticed how her fingers tightened around the phone. Her face changed in seconds, the way clouds can suddenly darken a sunny day. "Michael," she said, and I knew something was wrong because she never called him Michael unless things were serious. I couldn't hear Dad's words, but I could see their effect. Mom's face grew paler with each passing second. Her free hand gripped the counter so hard her knuckles turned white. How bad is it?" she whispered. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for hours. I stood frozen, the knife still in my hand, vegetables forgotten. When Mom finally lowered the phone, her hands were shaking. "Sarah," she said, and her voice cracked a little. "Sit down, sweetheart." I sank into one of our kitchen island chairs, my heart pounding. "What's wrong?" "Is Dad okay?" Mom took a deep breath, and I noticed tears gathering in her eyes. "Your father's company, it's bankrupt." The words didn't make sense at first. Bankrupt was something that happened to other people, not to us. "What do you mean, bankrupt?" I asked, my voice small. "The market crashed," Mom explained, her words coming out in rushed breaths. "The investments, the properties, everything's gone." "Gone?" I repeated stupidly. "We have to sell the house," she continued, each word seeming to cause her physical pain. "The cars, the furniture, everything." My phone buzzed on the counter, but for once, I didn't reach for it. "Where will we go?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Mom's next words made my blood run cold. "Your father wants us to go to Oregon, to stay with your grandfather." My grandfather. Walter Thompson. I hadn't seen him in years, not since I was a little girl. He lived alone in some old Victorian mansion in the middle of nowhere, Oregon. My grandmother had passed away when I was too young to remember her. The memories I had of him were hazy, a tall man with kind eyes who used to give me candy and tell me stories. But what about school? I protested weakly. What about my friends? Mom's eyes were full of sympathy, but her voice was firm. We leave tomorrow morning. That night, I lay in my bed for the last time, staring at the ceiling I'd looked at every night for the past 18 years. My phone was flooded with notifications, friends sharing their latest adventures, influencers showing off their perfect lives. I turned it off. Everything felt surreal, like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. The next morning dawned gray and cold. Dad wasn't there to say goodbye. He'd left after the phone call, saying he had things to take care of. Mom and I packed what we could fit into her car, mostly clothes and a few precious mementos. I took one last look at my room, at the photos on the walls, the fairy lights strung across my ceiling. It felt like saying goodbye to a part of myself. The drive to Oregon was long and mostly silent. Mom tried to make conversation at first, but eventually gave up. I watched as the landscape changed from urban sprawl to endless highways, then to dense forests. My phone lost signal somewhere past the California border. It was like watching my old life fade away with each passing mile. We drove deeper into Oregon, taking turns that led us further from civilization. The roads got narrower, windier. Trees pressed in on both sides, their branches reaching across the road like grasping fingers. Finally, after what felt like hours of driving through nowhere, we turned onto a gravel road. That's when I saw it. The house loomed ahead of us, a Victorian monster against the gray Oregon sky. It was bigger than I remembered, and older. Paint peeled from its wooden sides, and some of the shutters hung crooked. The NT garden was a tangle of overgrown roses and ancient fruit trees. As we pulled up to the house, the front door opened. My grandfather stepped out onto the porch. He was thinner than I remembered, slightly stooped now. But there was something about his eyes that made me pause. They were fixed on me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "Grace," he called out, his voice carrying across the overgrown yard. "Sarah." He smiled, and for a moment, I saw the grandfather I remembered from my childhood. But there was something else there too, something I couldn't quite name. Mom got out of the car first, walking up to hug him. I followed more slowly, dragging my suitcase behind me. "Look at you," grandfather said, his eyes still on me. "All grown up." I managed a small smile, but something in his gaze made me want to look away. "Hi, grandfather," I said softly. He insisted on carrying my suitcase inside, leading us through the front door into a dim hallway. The house smelled of old wood and something else, a sweetness that reminded me of overripe fruit. "I've prepared rooms for both of you," he said, climbing the creaking stairs. "Sarah, you'll be in your mother's old room." The room was large but austere, with heavy wooden furniture and faded wallpaper. A single window looked out over the back garden, where more fruit trees swayed in the wind. "I hope you'll be comfortable," grandfather said, lingering in the doorway. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. That first night, I lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the old house. The wind whispered through gaps in the windows. The walls creaked and settled. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. I reached for my phone out of habit, but there was no signal, no Wi-Fi. Just darkness and silence. And somewhere below, I could hear footsteps. Slow, measured steps moving through the house. I pulled the covers up higher and tried to convince myself that this was just temporary. That soon, Dad would fix everything, and we'd go back to our real life in Beverly Hills. But as I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed. That the life I knew was gone forever. And in its place was something else, something that made the shadows in the corners of my room seem darker, deeper. Something that made me want to keep my eyes open, even as exhaustion pulled me under. Because in those last moments before sleep took me, I could have sworn I heard those footsteps stop. Right outside my door. The morning light filtered through the dusty window, casting strange patterns on the wooden floor. I woke to the sound of birds I didn't recognize, their calls alien and sharp. For a moment, I forgot where I was. Then reality crashed back in. The unfamiliar bed, the antique furniture, the musty smell, it wasn't a dream. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, but the no-service message mocked me. Downs. Tears. I could hear movement in the kitchen. The smell of coffee drifted up through the old house. I pulled on a sweater. The Oregon mornings were colder than I was used to and made my way down the creaking stairs. Mom was already at the kitchen table, cradling a coffee mug. Grandfather stood at the stove, his back to us. "Good morning, Sarah," he said without turning around. "I hope you slept well." "Fine," I lied, sliding into a chair next to Mom. He turned then, carrying a plate of perfectly arranged fruit. Apples, pears, and berries, all from his garden, he explained. "You need to keep your strength up," he said, his eyes lingering on me a moment too long. I picked at the fruit, aware of his gaze. Mom seemed oblivious, lost in her own thoughts. "I need to drive into town today," she announced suddenly. "Your father needs some paperwork signed." My head snapped up. "Can I come?" But before Mom could answer, Grandfather spoke. "The drive is long, and the weather looks uncertain." He gestured to the window, where dark clouds were gathering. "Sarah can help me in the garden today." Something in his tone made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. Mom nodded absently, already gathering her things. "I'll be back before dark," she promised, kissing the top of my head. I watched her car disappear down the gravel driveway, feeling oddly abandoned. "Well," Grandfather said, still standing too close. "Shall we see to the garden?" The garden was vast, stretching behind the house like a forgotten world. Fruit trees lined winding paths, their branches heavy with ripening fruit. Roses climbed ancient trellises, their thorns sharp and waiting. Grandfather walked ahead of me, pointing out different plants. His knowledge was impressive, but something about the way he spoke made me uneasy. He knew the history of every tree, every flower. "Your grandmother helped me plant these roses," he said, touching a blood-red bloom. "She had such delicate hands." His voice changed when he spoke of her, becoming softer, almost reverent. "You remind me of her sometimes," he added, turning to look at me. "The way you move, the grace in your gestures." I shifted uncomfortably, pretending to examine a nearby plant. "I barely remember her," I said. "You were very young when she passed," he agreed. "But beauty leaves an impression." The way he said it made my skin crawl. We worked in the garden for hours, pulling weeds and pruning branches. Grandfather seemed to always know where I was, even when I moved to different areas. His eyes followed me, though he tried to be subtle about it. By afternoon, dark clouds had rolled in, bringing with them a heavy, oppressive air. "We should go inside," Grandfather announced. "A storm's coming." The old house felt different without Mom there. Smaller somehow, yet more imposing. I retreated to the living room with a book I'd brought from home. The ancient sofa creaked as I sat down. Thunder rumbled in the distance. I tried to lose myself in the pages, but I could feel his presence. Grandfather moved through the house like a shadow. Sometimes in the kitchen, sometimes in his study. But always aware of where I was. The rain started, a steady drumming against the windows. "Would you like some tea?" His voice made me jump. He stood in the doorway, holding 2 steaming cups. I wanted to say no, but couldn't think of a polite way to refuse. "Thank you," I managed, taking the cup he offered. He sat in the armchair opposite me, his eyes never leaving my face. "You've grown into such a beautiful young woman," he said softly. "Your mother must worry about all the boys chasing after you." I stared into my tea, wishing Mom would come back. "I don't date much," I said shortly, hoping to end the conversation. "No," his voice held an odd note of satisfaction. "A girl like you should be careful. Most boys your age, they don't know how to treat something precious." The way he said precious made my stomach turn. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating his face in harsh white light. For a moment, his features seemed different, almost predatory. Then darkness returned, and he was just my grandfather again. But something had changed. I could feel it in the air between us, heavy with unspoken words. The storm grew stronger, rain lashing against the windows. Mom called to say she was staying in town overnight. The roads were too dangerous, she explained. I felt my heart sink as grandfather relayed the message. "Don't worry," he said, touching my shoulder. "I'll take good care of you." His hand lingered there, warm through my sweater. I pulled away, mumbling something about being tired. "Of course," he said, his voice understanding but his eyes sharp. "You should rest." I practically ran up the stairs to my room. Behind me, I could hear him moving through the house. "Checking the locks," he said. "Making sure we were safe," he said. "But safe from what?" That night, the storm raged outside my window. Tree branches scratched against the glass like skeletal fingers. I lay in bed, wide awake, listening. To the rain. To the wind. To the footsteps in the hallway. They would pass my door, pause, then continue. Pass, pause, continue. Like a dark pendulum, marking time in the night. I pulled the covers over my head, trying to block out the sounds. But I couldn't block out the knowledge that I was alone in this old house. Alone with a man who looked at me in ways a grandfather never should. Alone with someone who saw something in me that made my skin crawl. The storm finally began to ease near dawn. As exhaustion pulled me toward sleep, I made a decision. I had to tell Mom. Had to make her understand that something wasn't right here. That the grandfather I remembered from my childhood was gone. Replaced by someone who made the shadows seem darker. Someone who made me want to lock my door at night. But as sleep finally came, a small voice in my head whispered. Would she believe me? Or would she think I was just being dramatic? After all, he was family. And family was all we had left now. Mom returned the next afternoon, looking tired but relieved. "Your father's lawyers think they can save something," she said over dinner. "It might take a few weeks, but..." I barely heard the rest, my mind still wrestling with what to tell her. Grandfather sat at the head of the table, nodding at appropriate moments. His eyes, though, kept drifting to me. Days began to blur together in that old house. Mom spent most of her time on the phone with Dad or his lawyers. I tried to keep busy, to stay in open spaces where I could see everything around me. But somehow, Grandfather was always there. In the garden, pruning roses while watching me read. In the kitchen, preparing elaborate fruit plates I couldn't bring myself to eat. In the hallway, just standing, waiting. His gaze grew bolder with each passing day. the pretense of casualness slowly falling away. "You look lovely in that dress," he'd say, his voice thick with something I didn't want to understand. Or, "The sunlight makes your hair shine like gold." I started wearing baggy clothes, trying to hide myself. But his eyes seemed to see through everything. One particularly warm afternoon, Mom had gone into town again. I was in the living room, trying to distract myself with a book. The old sofa had become my refuge, a place where I could pretend to be somewhere else. "Sarah," his voice came from the doorway. "Would you walk with me in the garden?" It wasn't really a question. The garden was his domain, his pride. Every path carefully maintained, every tree meticulously pruned. He led me down winding paths I hadn't seen before. Deeper into the property, where the trees grew closer together. "Your grandmother loved these paths," he said softly. "She would walk here for hours." His hand brushed against mine as we walked. I pulled away, pretending to examine a nearby rose. "You have her grace," he continued. "Her beauty." "I should go back," I said quickly. "Mom might call Dash." His hand caught my wrist. Not hard, but firm enough to stop me. "Sarah," he said, his voice different now. Deeper. Hungrier. "Don't you feel it?" "Feel what?" I asked, though I knew. God help me, I knew. This connection between us. His other hand reached for my face. I jerked away, stumbling backward. "There is no connection," I said, my voice shaking. "You're my grandfather." His eyes darkened. "Blood is just biology," he whispered. "What I feel for you transcends that." I ran. Through the garden, past the roses, up the porch steps. Into the house that no longer felt like any kind of shelter. I could hear him calling my name. Soft. Insistent. I locked myself in my room, heart pounding. My hands shook as I reached for my phone. Still no signal. No way to call for help. No way to tell anyone what was happening. That night, I pushed a chair against my door. The footsteps still came. Slower now. More deliberate. They would stop outside my door. Sometimes for minutes at a time. I could hear his breathing. Could feel his presence through the wood. Morning came with a false sense of normalcy. Mom at the breakfast table, checking her emails. Grandfather making coffee, acting as if nothing had happened. But his eyes told a different story. They followed me constantly now. No pretense. No shame. Just hunger. I tried to tell Mom. "He looks at me strangely," I said one morning. She barely glanced up from her phone. "He's just lonely," she said. "It's been hard since your grandmother passed." But it was more than loneliness. I saw it in the way he arranged flowers in my room. In the fruit he would leave outside my door. In the poems he began to recite when we were alone. Love poems. Ancient words twisted into something dark and wrong. I started spending more time in my room. The walls became both prison and protection. I would sit by the window, watching the garden below. Sometimes I'd see him there. Standing. Waiting. Looking up at my window with those hungry eyes. Days stretched into weeks. The house seemed to grow around us. Shadows lengthened. Corners darkened. Every creak, every whisper of wind carried his presence. Mom's calls with Dad grew more frequent, more urgent. Something about settlements and negotiations. I barely listened anymore. All I could focus on was survival. keeping distance, staying safe. But in an old house with nowhere to go, with a man who knew every corner, every hiding place. Safety was an illusion. And then came the night of the storm. The night Mom had to go back to the city. Emergency meetings, she said, packing quickly. I'll be back tomorrow night. I wanted to scream, to beg her not to leave. But the words stuck in my throat. How could I explain what I couldn't even fully understand? She kissed my forehead, grabbed her keys. And then she was gone, leaving me alone. With him. With the shadows. With the hunger in his eyes that grew stronger with each passing hour. The storm rolled in as darkness fell. Thunder shook the old house to its foundations. Lightning turned the windows into strobing mirrors. And somewhere in the darkness, the footsteps began again. The storm raged outside, but the real tempest was within these walls. I sat on my bed, every muscle tense, listening. The footsteps were different tonight. More purposeful. They moved through the house like a dark tide, rising, rising. Lightning flashed, and for a moment, I saw his shadow beneath my door. Sarah. His voice was soft, almost lost in the thunder. Sarah, open the door. I pressed my hands against my ears, but his words slipped through. We need to talk about this. The doorknob rattled. My Ert stopped. Had I remembered to lock it? You feel it too, he continued. I see it in your eyes. Go away, I managed to whisper. Thunder crashed, and the house groaned around us. You're so like her, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Your grandmother, when she was young. Stop, I said, louder now. Please stop. She had the same grace, the same beauty. The doorknob turned. I had forgotten to lock it. The door opened slowly, revealing his silhouette. Lightning flashed again, illuminating his face. His eyes were dark, hungry. I backed away until I hit the wall. Grandfather, please. He stepped into the room. Don't call me that, he said softly. Not now. Not when we both know what this is. I looked desperately for an escape route. The window was too high. The door was blocked. He moved closer, one step at a time. I've watched you, he said. Since you arrived. Growing more beautiful each day. His hand reached out to touch my face. I jerked away, but the wall was behind me. Nowhere to go. This is wrong, I said, my voice shaking. You're my grandfather. Labels, he whispered. Society's constraints. But love. His hand touched my cheek. And something in me snapped. I shoved him, hard. He stumbled backward, surprise flickering across his face. I darted past him, through the door. Down the dark hallway. Thunder crashed overhead as I ran down the stairs. His footsteps followed. Heavy. Determined. I reached the front door, yanked it open. Rain poured in, cold and sharp. Behind me, his voice called out. Sarah, wait. But I was already running. Into the storm. Into the darkness. The garden was a maze of shadows and lightning. Rain soaked through my clothes in seconds. Branches whipped at my face as I ran. Behind me, I could hear him. Calling my name. Getting closer. I ran deeper into the garden, past the roses he tended so carefully. Past the fruit trees that bore his obsession. The ground was slick with mud and fallen leaves. My foot caught on something, a root, a stone. I fell hard. Pain shot through my ankle. And then his hands were on me, pulling me up. "You're hurt," he said, voice full of concern. As if he wasn't the reason I was running. "Let me help you inside." "Don't touch me," I screamed, my voice lost in the thunder. Lightning flashed, and I saw his face. The mask of concern had slipped. Something darker showed beneath. "You don't understand," he said. "What we have is special." "We don't have anything," I spat. I tried to pull away, but his grip tightened. "Your grandmother didn't understand at first either." The words hit me like ice water. "What?" He smiled, a terrible gentle smile. "She was young, like you. Beautiful, like you." Horror rose in my throat. "You're sick," I whispered. His face darkened. "Love isn't sickness," he growled. His grip tightened until it hurt. Lightning split the sky. And in that brilliant moment, I saw headlights. Coming up the driveway. Mom's car. "Mom!" I screamed. "Mom, help!" His hand clamped over my mouth. But it was too late. Car doors slammed. Voices called out. "Sarah? Sarah, where are you?" Not just Mom's voice. Dad's too. Grandfather's grip loosened. I wrenched away from him, stumbling toward the voices. Toward the lights. Toward safety. "Sarah." Mom's arms wrapped around me. "You're soaked." "What happened?" I looked back toward the garden. But Grandfather was gone. Melted into the shadows he knew so well. Dad's hand was on my shoulder. "We've got good news," he said. "We can go home." The lawyers worked everything out. I started to shake. Not from the cold. From relief. From horror. From everything I couldn't say. They helped me inside. Got me warm clothes. Made excuses for Grandfather's absence. "Probably in his study," Mom said. "He always retreats there during storms." I said nothing. What could I say? The truth was too horrible. Too impossible to explain. We left the next morning. Grandfather didn't appear to say goodbye. But as we drove away, I looked back at the house. A figure stood at an upstairs window. Watching. Always watching. The garden disappeared behind us. Then the house. Then all of it. But some shadows don't fade with distance. Some secrets burrow deep and stay there. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear footsteps. Still feel those eyes. Still remember the hunger in his voice when he spoke of love. Of beauty. Of things that should never be spoken between grandfather and granddaughter. I never told my parents what happened in that house. Some truths are too heavy to share. But I learned something in those dark weeks. About the masks people wear. About the shadows that live in familiar faces. And about the importance of running. Even when there's nowhere to go. End.